Now, our next speaker is Dr. Katina Michael. Katina is a professor in the School of Computing and Information Technology and a member of the Center for Persuasive Technology and Society at the University of Wollongong in Australia. Katina is the editor-in-chief of IEEE Technology and Society magazine, and she's also senior editor of IEEE Consumer Electronics magazine. Katina researches emerging technologies within the national security and biomedical space. She and her husband, M.G. Michael, developed the concept of Uberveillance and the implications from embedded surveillance devices. And I must say, they also wrote a fabulous book on the topic. I have it. It's great. Katina is a board member of the Australian Privacy Foundation. Katina, I always learn so much from you. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's a pleasure to be online this evening. The first thing I'd like to do is to say that I was asked to talk on the future of persuasive technologies in the Internet of Medical Things space, and that's what I'm going to do. I want you to take the wonderful presentations of Steve and also of the wonderful Dave presentation that was spoken about a moment ago. Dave, you're a hard act to follow, and talk about where we're going with the Internet of Medical Things. And it is a bit of stargazing and trailblazing, but everything I'm going to speak about has literally occurred to this point, and I would like to share some of those insights with you from my 20 years or so of study. I want to look at the end-to-end value chain of the Internet of Medical Things and talk about going from pervasive diagnostics right through to personalized medicine and persuasive technology. So in the first instance, I have a slide here where I show the Scanadu products, which have been in development now for some 10 years, which actually monitor one's vital signs. And in a future Internet of Medical Things, what you want is people who are dealing with chronic diseases not to have to go to hospital just for their vital signs to be taken, just for bloods to be taken, just for ECGs to be taken or blood pressure readings. And having elderly parents and aunts and uncles, I see this phenomena ongoing where I have to personally take people into the hospital or to the doctor's surgery in a regional center just for their vital signs to be taken, and it is disruptive. It also means that people are increasingly exposed to infections as they travel around places where people are sick. And a lot of my national security work is all about quarantining people. It's about basically serving your illness from home or your infection from home so that you don't spread it, just like we know normal viruses spread from person to person, particularly because bacteria is left behind because people are not good at hand washing. Very simplistic things which unfortunately drive viruses. So if we can do pervasive diagnostics, and even if it's not for chronic disease management, what if it's for everyday life? People are starting to wonder, what do we do to actually make people more healthy, or healthier, I should say? And if we find ourselves in a situation where something is out of whack, our heart rate, our blood pressure, for alerts to be sent to a care management center, or at least perhaps even to our mobile device in the future in a secure way, despite that we all know that anything sent over a wireless interface is not secure. But in the most secure way that we know to create solutions as engineers, to be able to send alerts back saying, you know, there is something that doesn't look correct there in the profile of the individual's health pattern, and maybe you need to see a doctor. The personalized medicine aspect is excellent for chronic disease management, particularly because people who are suffering from either mental disorders or physical disorders require to be taking their medicines daily and on time. And so one of the things that we see with personalized medicine is a customized management plan. For instance, if someone is born into the world with a syndrome, how do you respond to that syndrome, and what kind of care management plan? A lot of us see doctors for particular syndromes, whereby we are trying to help our children, for instance, on a care management plan, and what you hope is that that plan also takes advantages of those government tax breaks or government rebates or government incentives to support that care management plan, but also for the individual who's the sufferer to be taking their medicines on time. Particularly with mental disorders, we see that things can go very ugly very quickly in terms of suicide rates. One person suicides every suicide once every 20 seconds, which is a huge estimate to be considering that close to 1 million people suicide annually, and much of that is to blame because people are coming on to drugs and off drugs very quickly, and so somebody who's intermittently taking drugs for mental disorders is at risk of failures, and that is not a failure of our medical system as such. It is a failure of the individual to take their medicines on time. This happens also with dementia sufferers. And so what we need is personalized medicine targeted at the individual for their vital signs as they're going day by day, and this is something that we can't monitor at the moment. And then there's almost the end-to-end cycle where you've gone from measuring vital signs or conducting diagnostic tests to providing a care management plan and responding with personalized medicine, and then persuasive technology. Once someone perhaps is in recovery or rehabilitation, how do we actually persuade them to continue to eat healthy, to have bodily movement, so that they're walking at least 3 times a week for half an hour each session, and then to inspire them and motivate them? Can we design technologies and ethical technologies that are there to persuade people to have the right kinds of diet and the right kinds of exercise beyond recovery and rehabilitation? And then, of course, that persuasive technology is being fed by vital signs and diagnostics and that kind of profile. So it's this cycle that we envisage we might be able to tap into, going from vital sign measurement to customized medicine to persuasive technology to encourage us to continue on our plan. If we look at diagnostics for a moment, a couple of years ago, we had IEEE Spectrum create and write an article on Medtronic, the wonderful company that is there to provide so much healthcare, either through their brain stimulation devices and a whole suite of not just brain-centric implantables, but also physical, general life implantables for life maintenance, life sustaining, and gradually towards life enhancement. And what you see here is a device that they said they would like to have one of these sensors placed in everyone, and literally that's taking the external Scanadu device that you saw in the previous slide and internalizing that with a bunch of sensors that can monitor physiological characteristics in the body. And that device is not bigger than a AAA battery, as you can see there from the slide. And it starts to emanate feelings of, well, should we all be bearing one of these technologies? What does it mean to bear a technology such as this? Where is the data that is emanating from these devices stored? And how is it being used? And how might it be used? It would be great if one of these devices, for instance, could figure out whether I was about to have a fall down problem, if I was stumbling, and I'm very much about location-based services, so real-time location systems and sensors which can actually show and track a behavioral pattern, for instance, of a patient in the home who's stumbling or looks like they're going to fall. We could, preempt an emergency call either to a carer or to actually emergency service organizations to support that individual. We would have to be very accurate about behavioral biometrics if we were going to create such end-to-end systems, but people are thinking about these things. The other thing is, who owns the information on this Medtronic device? I know from my studies in heart pacemakers, many of the patients have attempted to access their own patient data coming from their heart pacemaker, but in many cases, almost all of them I believe, manufacturers claim to own the data emanating from the person's ECG stream. And that's a fascinating whole concept which we can talk about a bit later in the presentation, but the ownership of your own physiological heartbeat data being owned by a manufacturer and not yourself is a fascinating thing. And of course, manufacturers are claiming that the reason why this is the case is because they need to be fine-tuning their products, they need to be creating more availability for themselves, and it's really too confusing for a patient, for instance, to be interpreting their own ECG data, and it can be misinterpreted. And so far, what we have is doctors now providing printouts of some of this data to their, heart pacemaker recipients. But I think ongoing, if we are moving towards this Internet of Medical Things, what we need to be doing is empowering the consumer, empowering the patient with their own data, empowering carers who are monitoring patients from home with the information just in time, I would say, because that is the real deal. I think manufacturers need to be careful to mandate the ownership of that data, especially because it's biometric personal data, and we can talk about privacy and personal data later on again. So if you've gone from this diagnostics view, I just want you to hypothetically imagine a world where every individual that's born into the world actually has a sensor embedded for health management or diagnostics and taking of vital signs, or as exceptions, maybe those who are under chronic disease management plans to have one of these sensors embedded. So if I move on to the next slide, what we have here is the company Proteus with Abilify, who have put forward to the FDA very recently a submission which looks at the potential for some drug, particularly to help with major depressive disorder, MDD, to be embedded with a Proteus ingestible sensor in a single tablet. So imagine all your pharmaceuticals, all your drugs actually coming with an ingestible sensor tagged with the tablet. So you're basically ingesting or swallowing the tablet, and that tablet device has a small sensor embedded in them which can denote when someone is taking the medication correctly, what kinds of things are changing in the body at the cell level, even potentially in the future, and what this means for discovery in terms of how we manage disease. I was recently approached by the Register to comment on an article by Stanford University that was published, which looked at the way that we might embed tiny RFID micrometer level devices. They're not nanoscale, they're not millimeter level, they are micrometer level, somewhere in between the nanoscale and the millimeter level, and looking at how we can place these RFIDs in cells to track and monitor changes in the body. And of course, this may well provide us with greater insights into things like human diseases of cancer, of heart disease, of diabetes in particular, so that we know what's happening in the cell, we know what's happening in neighboring cells, we know how things are changing in the body. But I want you to think about a future where we might have many of these RFIDs actually ingested into the body, monitoring different things for people with complications of different organs, particularly towards end of life. If this is a requirement to either a breakthrough technology, a clinical trial of some sort, or just monitoring the pain management of the individual at end of life. But cells are like, if I liken it to a house, we've got bricks in a house, and they're put together and they hold the house up. Well, that's what cells do in the human body. And it's interesting that this Stanford University group of professors, of medical experts and engineers have come together to potentially look at this kind of thing. Now, in the case of Proteus, they're not actually talking about these kinds of RFID sensors in the body. They're talking about other kinds of ingestible sensors, not of the Stanford University metal wire type, but some different kind of capacity, which uses the body itself to actually power the sensor. And Proteus's position is this. They said the farmers were doing fantastic. At the beginning of the last century, they were creating new drugs, and they weren't easily generalizable. But today what we have is an oversupply of drugs, and there's no money in creating things. According to Proteus's CEO, drugs are no longer not replicatable. Drugs, in terms of the breakthrough technologies like penicillin and so forth, and aspirin, we've gone to that level. We're not going to get anywhere more. And what they are actually talking about is digital drugs. And that's the digital medicine that will take us to the next phase. And so what we've gone through is again diagnostics to personalized medicine perhaps, and finally persuasive technology, whereby we cover that end-to-end cycle. So I am taking my drugs on time and in the right way, and then I'm coming out of recovery, and what do I do? You know, how do I actually say, what can I do with that information? And we all have mobile phones, Samsung S Health application, and then now myriads of health applications online that look at your location, look at your time, your distance, your speed, your vital signs. For instance, if I hold my finger on the back of my Samsung phone, it looks at my levels of stress. We can actually monitor whether someone is doing great in their recovery or not. And we haven't had this much information to the consumer, to the end user, to the patient ever before. And it's in people's fingertips now. Back in 2006, MG Michael founded the term Uberveillance. This is long before the company Uber. And we were talking at the time about identity, location, and condition. Right now, we have an excellent way through a myriad of various devices that are wearables or implantables to actually identify. We know the who. And we actually even know the who via behavioral biometrics. Someone's gait, someone's pattern of movement, someone's daily lifetime movement patterns can denote who they are, can identify them. We're all different. Even how we check our mobile phone can differentiate us very uniquely, actually. Whether we fire up our phone in a particular way, go through our apps in a particular walkthrough, these things identify. Location now is embedded in everything, whether it's Bluetooth capacity within a building, within a room, or it's real-time location systems which are more GPS-based. We have these capabilities now, you know, with these chipsets and everything that show location. Even the router we're locked to can denote our IP location. So that's no problem, but the condition is something that we're struggling with. Back in 2006, MG Michael had interviewed the director of Biomedical Institute at Imperial College London, Professor Chris Tomazu, who spoke to us at length about condition. And he had a child at the time that was suffering from chronic kidney issues. He was on dialysis, and again, he spoke about this issue of having to take the child in. It was very disruptive. Vital signs had to be taken, etc., etc. But the question is now, how do we monitor condition? Do we wear these wearable plasters, these wearable band-aids, or these wearable plastics? This is an iRhythm a device. But basically, if I know who you are, where you are, and I know things about your vital signs, I'm actually conducting human activity monitoring. I want you to think about Google Nest in the home being transported to a wearable device or an implantable device, which actually is, you know, your Google You or your You. We call it the iPlant, but many people will call it various things. Now, in Chris's case, Christopher Tomazu, the great professor, he was talking about, you know, wearable devices being, you know, just the right kind of balance between personal privacy and also what we require for vital signs. And then there are others who talk about going implantable, and that's really what Uberveillance is. It's about embedded surveillance devices in the human body. Call it a black box recorder of sorts, but it's about what's happening within. It's measuring vital signs, it's measuring movement, and it's measuring your level of health. Now, going back to Proteus, I have an illustrative example here by the company's CEO, Andrew Thompson. And what we can see in this slide is the powerful new metrics that are coming from these wearable plaster devices. In this instance, we have an 84-year-old with mild dementia, and a human activity monitoring report looks something like this. This indicates in the blue, the person is resting, in the red, they're standing, in the light blue, they're sitting, and it shows a pattern of movement through the day. It also shows us a medication-taking behavior so that the body can monitor when, day by day, over a 60-day period in this instance, you can see that the person is taking their medicines accurately day by day. In the next slide, what we see is somebody who's got mild dementia at 90 years of age and whose patterns are all over the place. They're not sitting for long, they're not standing for long, they're spasmodic, sporadic. Their medication-taking behavior is not perfect, it's not aligned, it's not taken every day, and so obviously there would be some issues. We can also see the dementia firing up in this instance of the 90-year-old person. And of course, when you're looking at remote care possibilities for aged care, you want to have children who are able to look into their parents' stature and know that they're safe and well. And so you can see between the slide 1, someone with stability and recovery, and slide 2, somebody who needs more care and more management of their drugs day by day. Now, this shouldn't surprise you, but back in 2002-03, there was a company called Digital Angel that was looking at this kind of data, fall down alerts. And many of you would have heard about the Very Chip organization, which had a personal health record implantable device, which they tried to get off the ground. It was a New York Stock Exchange company that went out of commission, was sold later by somebody to somebody else. And what we found is that the market was premature for these implantable devices. However, if that's where IoMT is going, active implantable medical devices to control perhaps stimulation to the brain, stimulation to the body, patient quality of life monitoring and tracking, where are we going with this? I'll leave you with these two to look at later. It's a 10-year-old, actually 13-year-old now, FDA approves the Very Chip clip on NBC. And then there's an Andrew Thompson of Proteus Health discussing the future vision of pharma in digital medicine. So basically, and I'll end with this slide to allow for questions. I know I've only gotten through half of my PowerPoint pack with security and privacy potential issues to the individual now. We're not just talking about wireless devices in a hospital or a network, but actually the safety, the security breaches at the person level. So what we've really discussed till now in this presentation is the size of devices and platforms going from, you know, your mobile computing to your wearable computing to your more invasive ingestible computing or implantable devices that stay there and monitor vital signs. We've looked at how pharma has traditionally created things and is now moving towards things that can be digital objects or drugs that are now digital objects on the Internet of Medical Things. And we're right at the beginning of a wave of digital drugs being customized for individual use cases. So I'll just stop there, Rebecca, and see if we have any questions.
Sure, and thank you so much. I mean, my goodness, think of what can go on here. We do have a couple of questions. I'm going to hold them to the end of the presentation, if that's okay. One of them has to do with, you know, the implications of ransomware for implantables. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. And maybe after our next session here, which will be a regulatory roundtable, we can come back to that. I also have another question to come back to also with regard to blockchain. But thank you so much. Such interesting stuff. And we'll move on now to our next session.